Welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Plasto Blasto podcast. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Today, Pat and I are going to be talking about longer range airsoft replicas. In particular, we'll talk about how we've built them in the past, what we're using currently, but also how you might go on this journey yourself and a few pitfalls to avoid. But before we get into it, a couple of different announcements. So, firstly, if you are looking to support the channel in a meaningful way, there's two things that you can do. Firstly, it's our merch store on Threadless. The link is in the description where you can get really cool different types of material, some of our logos printed on shirts, including this design that I'm wearing right now.
Which is awesome.
Which is absolutely amazing. It was created by one of our Discord community members. I absolutely love it to death. I've had it printed myself, and it's awesome. So that's a really cool design that's available on our Threadless store. Additionally, our Discord community members voted on a community patch that we put into production and is available now for everyone to purchase. And the patch looks like this. I'm bringing it closer to the screen, but essentially it is a patch that contains our logo with the rider and the axe, but as well it has the whole the earth on it basically, and it says global community because our Discord community is a melting pot of all the different countries around the world. And so if you want to get one of these patches, you can get it signed by me or unsigned, your choice, for the same cost. It is $15 Canadian, and that includes shipping anywhere in the world. The link for that is in the description, and you can buy it. And like I said, it's $15 Canadian, whatever that translates to your currency, shipped anywhere in the world at that cost, no extra shipping. So if you want to do that, the link is in the description. It's on the Discord. It's very easy to find. So with that being said, let's dive into the episode. And I think we've talked firstly recently at length about magnified optics for airsoft. So we're not going to talk about those again today, even though I'm sure our old pal Matt wouldn't mind. But today we're really going to focus on other aspects of longer range airsoft replicas, longer range airsoft play. And we're going to loosely break it down into two parts. One is going to be more about sort of the rifle setups, and the other part is going to be more on the gameplay. And this is interesting. This was a suggestion that Matt actually made on the Discord. This is one of the first things we talked about on the podcast. I think this was on episode 4 or something like that, which at this point, it's been something like almost 3 years since we recorded that episode. And Pat, before we recorded, Pat and I were talking about this, and like a lot has happened in 3 years. Global Pando notwithstanding, there's also the fact that we've created the Discord and we've been exposed to a lot of new opinions about airsoft, which resulted in us really taking an adventure down the road of HPA, which of course we've talked about a lot and we're going to talk about again today. But it has also changed our perspective on how to build accurized airsoft replicas. And it has also changed our opinion on how you play with those replicas and so on and so forth. So some of the stuff that we talked back then is not that it's dated, but we always talk about how you should revisit your opinions about airsoft and make sure that you're still doing the right thing or there's not better ways. And it turns out there are better ways, and we've discovered some. And so we're going to look at some of that today and have some conversations.
One of the really big pieces that sort of comes out of thinking back in that way is that the Discord has provided us with access to a lot of opinions that are sort of outside of the soap bubble of airsoft in Canada, which has been really helpful. It provided me with new text to hang out with and chat with and steal ideas from. Hi, Chaz.
Yeah.
But it's also provided me with people going, hey, I know this thing might be harder to get in Canada, but it is worth looking into.
Yeah.
I'm not inherently sort of lazy about going and getting stuff from other places, but like shipping to me from the States right now costs about $40.
Yeah, exactly.
So I try to avoid it unless it's something I know I really want.
Well, yeah, and it's funny because that's part of the reason that when I created the patch page for the community patch, I wanted people to be able to just have the shipping included, because if I were to ship that with like a parcel, for example, to the United States, even something as small as that patch, the shipping would be probably 30 to 40% of the cost of the patch itself. right? And similar, like if we were talking about earlier about like different barrels and stuff from Amped Airsoft, I mean, that will be 40 or 50% of our order if we're only buying one thing. So hence, trying to pull together and buy multiple things at once. But
Yeah,
we'll talk about
it's
that in
very
a
much a
second.
trying to be organized about it kind of
Yeah.
thing.
The other part that I'm really excited to talk about as well is the gameplay aspect of long range airsoft, because I think this is one idea that for many airsofters it tends to be a pitfall. There's this desire, of course, to run a longer range replica, and you want to be able to snipe, quote unquote, snipe your opponents outside of their range and all this kind of stuff. In other words, to not have to worry about getting hit yourself while being able to hit everybody else. And that
Well,
doesn't really shake out in reality, and we'll talk about that. But first, I think a good place
I
to start
was
is
it's funny because I was with you up until the not getting shot at and hit part, right? Like
yeah,
mindset stuff.
yeah. And I mean, like, you're playing airsoft, you're going to get hit. Like, that's part of it, right? But I think before we get into that, even though that's the one that I think is I'm a bit more excited to talk about personally, I think we can talk about the rifles. And we talked about this again in the past. And since the Discord, really, like you were talking about having exposure to different texts and you can talk about stuff, but there's a lot of really good knowledge and science, right, that gets dropped in the podcast, like low key science. If you want to learn about like volumes and all kinds of stuff, like in the stuff that I don't understand, PS. But in the references section, there's a lot of really good material in there. And as a consequence of that, even through osmosis, you start to just realize that there's more information out there that is reliable. And so just the other day, I was thinking about 6.01 millimeter barrels, and I was like, oh yeah, Koro, what's your tier list for barrels right now? And he just dropped like the six, in order of the best in class to still really good barrels, right? And like that's having that sort of resource has really changed my perspective, and I think yours as well. And I don't want to speak for you, but I
No,
think
it
as
definitely
we've talked
has.
about, yeah.
I have the odd morning where I look at the Discord, and like, I don't talk as much as I read, I'm afraid. Pretty much everyone knows that, I think, at this point. But where I read the Discord and I'm like, oh god, they're talking about physics again. It's 8 a.m. I can't do this.
Yeah.
But that's not a suggestion that you guys should stop. Just I shouldn't read physics at 8 a.m.
Yeah. One of the big
So
things that we had talked about, I think, initially was around this concept of like achievable accuracy, right? So when you're thinking about your long range build or whatever, one of the core ideas for us 3 years ago, and I don't believe that has changed, is this idea of what is the actual realistically achievable accuracy for your airsoft rifle. Like there's people going out there being like, oh yeah, I want to build a rifle that shoots reliably at up to 200 meters, like 600 feet. Like bro, that is not gonna happen, right?
I,
Unless you're shooting like cannons or whatever. Like it's not a thing, right?
that's a new hobby you need to take up. It's called target shooting. It
Yeah,
uses
really.
rifles.
Yeah.
you know,
But one aspect that I don't think we talked about in that episode, but you and I have talked about this before. It's not just about realistically achievable accuracy, but I would also say there's a piece around realistically applicable accuracy, right? Or realistically applicable range. Like we've talked about this before. I remember we were playing a D-Day game and I was getting frustrated because I couldn't hit the opponents at the other side of the field, which is pretty much like the longest range that we're realistically going to shoot on the field at frontline. And your take to me at the time was like, bro, like, why do you care? Like, we played this game mode like once every couple of weeks and once every month. Do you want to build a rifle for this particular use case, or would you rather have a rifle that you can use everywhere all the time with no, MED and all this kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, and like at the time, it was sort of a, like to give a bit more context, that was a conversation about, like, do we want to rebuild Phil's gun into sort of a semi-locked DMR that's pushing the field's FPS limits for an AEG, which, I'm more than capable of doing. Like, it's not a problem. But, okay, yeah, it's fantastic for this one game mode, but you're going to have to use your sidearm every time we're playing a game that is CQB.
Which is way more often. Because typically we play one D-Day game. Let's say we play one D-Day game per outing, right? Which is not true, right? It's like 0.5, but whatever, on average. But let's say it's one. But in that same game, we'll play at least 2 village games, probably 4.
And
right?
probably also a couple of road games, and your MED on that rifle was going to be 50 feet ish, which puts you inside your MED for half of that field, a
If
third.
not more. If not more, yeah.
So, yeah, it just sort of it works out to in practice being an odd thing. Like one of the things that realistically I'm not sure we've addressed in a really long time. It's funny
Mhm.
because I don't think about that episode about long range airsoft rifles as a thing that we did 3 years ago. I think about it as a thing we did recently,
Yeah, yeah, I
because that's
agree.
how my brain works. You know, in the same way that like I talk about movies and that I've seen, and my students are like, "Sir, I was two." Hmm. um, teach your
Zoomers,
life.
man, what are you gonna do?
We old. Um, so, one of the things that's probably worth mentioning is that I'm actually running my long barreled rifle um, at around a 420 FPS, like 1.5 joule range, um, inside of our field's standard rifle limits 99.9% of the time for the same reason. I want to get achievable accuracy that reaches as far as I can within those limits. But that's chiefly a functionality of dealing with situations where, and this happens regularly, where people are far from me and think they can hit me, and I am far from them and know I can hit them.
Mhm.
Situations which usually work out in my favor. So, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, so like I could tune the rifle to longer ranges really easily. Like, I mean, it's HPA. It's, turn the key. All right, cool. We're DMR now.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't generally feel that it is sort of worth the air quotes drawbacks. I might play around with that more this year because I have the SMG, and I'm probably going to be using that for more of our CQB games just because it's hilarious. I
Mhm.
really like it. But we'll see how that all plays out over the summer and the spring coming year. Um,
So,
but that is worth mentioning.
yeah. So let's go back. I think for those who maybe did not listen to that episode, because it is 3 years ago, and I think many
Yeah,
people have discovered the podcast perhaps more recently, not necessarily gone back and
no,
listened to the
legit.
backlog. Some of those episodes are a bit rough, especially at the beginning. So I don't blame you. But like
It's
when
been
we
a
talk
learning
about,
experience.
well, yeah, it's yeah, it took a while to get where we are today. Let's put it that way. Um, for those who weren't familiar with the concept, like when we talk about realistically achievable accuracy, like what does that mean to you specifically?
So, um, kind of the opposite of what I get watching a lot of YouTube videos about airsoft, where people are like, oh, I'm going to shoot my airsoft replica and it's going to hit people 300 feet away. First shot all the time. Sure, cool. If you are succeeding at that with an AEG or a HPA setup that's like running a reasonable FPS, please come on our Discord and tell me how. I wish to learn. Um, you know, so realistically, from my point of view, right? If a stock airsoft gun has sort of I fire 5 rounds and I land 2 of them at 150 feet, say, I would like my gun to do it in one at 150 feet. Two is okay, but like one would be good.
Mhm.
Um, out to 200 feet, you do get people like, oh yeah, I'm getting just first round shots. Um, I think that's achievable with a really dialed in bolt action, regardless of what you're using to power source it, assuming that you've spent the time and energy and gotten it set up. But at 200 feet, running, I run 0.32 RMBBs. So I'm getting as little deviation as you can probably effectively run on a setup that's also capable of full auto and being used quasi close. Um, I would like at 200 feet to fire 5 rounds and land one on you.
Yeah.
And the magnified optic makes it closer to 3 most days, if you're not moving.
Yeah. And
There's
notice that he said 200 feet, right? We did not 200 meters, right? And so 200 feet is what, like 65, 66 meters or something like
somewhere in
that,
there. I've never been
right?
good at that conversion, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Um,
It's like, but anyways, it's pretty good, right?
you know,
It's a perfectly reasonable, perfectly acceptable. And if you think about, again, our airsoft field that we play on, 200 feet will generally span the front to back of most of the different quote unquote maps that we play on. Definitely
Yep.
the village, no question.
Yep.
Road game maybe a little dicey. D-Day maybe also dicey if you're going like crosswise, like in a diagonal.
Yeah.
Other than that, I
So
mean, you're pretty much good, right?
so I guess the next thing to talk about then is like how we're achieving that currently.
Yeah.
Because probably the biggest change for us is that how we're achieving that has definitely altered over the last couple of years. We've tried a significant quantity of parts that we hadn't tried previously. Also, HPA as a thing is newer than that episode to us. So,
Yeah.
um, we have switched over from manufacturing our own RHOPS patches to using Elvish Tack ones. I still have days when I think the ones we made custom were like a tiny bit better, but not 8 hours of my time better.
Yeah, definitely.
you know,
I remember how much time you were spending on those R hops, and they're so finicky. And then I remember when we got the Elvish hack ones, and it was like, no big deal. And it was very like, what exactly just happened here? Because this is supposed to be witchcraft, and you just did it, and it worked fine,
yeah,
basically right off the rip.
yeah, it's sort of a, like seems sus, but yeah, I'm very happy with those. I like I said, I think it's maybe possible to get better performance out of a couple of tinkering around with like you doing your own, or Steph's had a really good luck with S hopping stuff, but they work well within the sort of tolerances that I want,
Hmm.
and are easy, and I like that part.
Yeah, they're
um,
definitely worth the expense. Like for us, I think they're like 20 bucks Canadian,
yeah,
something somewhere around there. And like, I don't know how much an hour of your time, listener, is worth, but for me, throwing 20 bucks at a problem to save myself some time is often worth it. I'm not going
yeah.
to say all the time, but most of the time.
But like, yeah, there are many problems we will solve there,
Yeah.
and like as we've talked about in some other episodes, I'm in a place in my life where I have a finite amount of time I can dedicate to airsoft, and so spending 8 hours teching on a gun is fine. I don't mind doing it, but that is sometimes going to mean that's 8 hours I don't have to play.
Yeah.
Um, so this is inconvenient, right? We wish to balance that out if we can manage it. Oh, sorry.
So we got the R hops,
Yep.
right, which we talked about. So since we did that episode, the Elvish Tack R hops are definitely the go-to for us, and that works for us because our local, or not local, but semi-local provider in Andy's Airsoft is able to both provide the barrels and the appropriate Elvish Tack patches for those barrels, which makes it super convenient as a one-stop shop. I think one of the limiting factors for us in getting other types of barrels or what have you has been just availability, right? Do they have what we want in a way that is not going to cost us our, an arm, a leg, and perhaps our firstborn child
Yeah.
in shipping, right?
Exactly. There before Christmas, I was looking at some PDI 6.0 ones,
Yep.
um, which have a pretty good reputation, as far as I can tell. And they weren't available anywhere in Canada at the time. And getting them from Amped was going to cost me $300 for two,
Yeah, which is
which is
prohibitively expensive.
pretty rough. Like we both decided, like, maybe not at that price. Now, part of that is, we both got what I think are good barrels in our
Yeah,
guns. I am convinced at this point, courtesy of the Discord, really, that 6.0 ones are an experiment I want to try. And I think that that experiment is probably most valuable on the longer guns that we're running.
I would
Um,
definitely agree.
I just also, don't necessarily have $300 to throw at that problem today.
Just willy nilly. Yeah, no, I definitely agree. But other places that we have thrown money on airsoft recommendations since the podcast 3 years ago. The hop up units. So we've switched to the rotary style hop up units, in particular the max hop up units,
Yep.
for better or for worse, in certain cases because of the guns that we were using, et cetera, et cetera. That required a little bit of finagling. But once we got those working, they were
Yeah.
excellent, right?
They're,
And that's on the more on the consistency side, I guess, right?
yeah. Well, I mean, and that's sort of, our big sort of goal, and the way we like to think about uh, accuracy in airsoft is in practice that we want the BB to go to the same place every time we pull the trigger, or as much as you can manage with a spherical projectile. um,
Mhm.
so the Type O barrel helps, obviously. Having a hop up unit that is machined to really tight tolerances is fantastic. It's also a huge pain in the ass,
Yeah.
as we discovered,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. No question.
the amount of feeding problems caused by point 0.5 of a millimeter on the front end of a nozzle is probably not a thing that I would talk about comfortably. Like, oh my god,
But
and
I
like
think, if you're
now that I know to
sorry, go
look
ahead.
for it, it's really not a problem. But yeah, if you're gonna be getting into the sort of like, oh, I want really like super precision, like Max is a really good brand, definitely at this point. Hop up units, be aware that that comes with tailoring everything else to make sure it works with them, which
Yeah.
is both worthwhile and a pain.
There's a huge not it's not even like a learning curve, I would say, but it's like there's so many things that go into the teching aspect of it, and some of it is so minute, so small, that if you're doing this for the first time, like, there really is sort of a progression order, which we're not really going to get into, but like trying to build a highly accurized, for lack of a better term, DMR style airsoft replica as a first upgrade might not be your first port of call. Like, there should be other things that you probably need to
Yeah,
do.
there are
Um,
there's definitely, and this honestly might be a thing we should revisit in a later episode. Like, there's definitely a sort of triage list, work your way from here to here on building your airsoft replica in general.
yeah.
And I absolutely love max hop ups. Do not just go buy one to shove in your gun willy nilly. It
And,
probably won't work out for you.
yeah, and that's a fair point
It
too,
might,
because like I think there's a
but
difference between like the best in class upgrade that you can get and the best upgrade that you can get that is easy to install, right? Like,
definitely.
there's the best, like, sort of quote unquote plug and play, right? That you can just slap into any gun that will work basically. Like, just to use an easy example, like, there's probably like a best motor that you can just drop into your gun and not have to think about anything else, right? Um, but the max hop up for us in our experience is an excellent piece of kit, but and the butt is pretty big here, right? And I'm not talking like Sir Mix-a-Lot butts. Like, I mean, like, this is a very big butt that is as impactful as sort of what I was experiencing, which is, double feed, misfeeds, like crazy wild velocities, all because the nozzle is off by half of a millimeter, right? Which is a measurement that most people in their day-to-day lives would never encounter, right? So there's a lot of finessing that comes with that, and so as your first project, probably not the best idea. But we've gone way off tangent there. So the max hop up is something that has changed. I don't think we've really revisited sort of our actual hop up rubbers themselves. Like, I think we're pretty much
uh,
using like the modified stuff like we always have.
we actually did. I just don't think I told you.
Oh, that's fair enough. Yeah.
I think those were just a thing that I bought. Um, I am going to hopefully be right. I literally would have to go check the bag of them in the back room. I think we are currently using maple leaf hard type ones
Oh, okay.
um,
Yep.
for our hop. I bought a few of them. There's a specific one that Max recommends that I was like, all right,
Oh, yes,
we'll
you're
we'll
absolutely right. And
we'll
you
try that.
did tell me this. So that's egg on my
Um,
face. It's because I'm old and I'm a boomer and I forgot. But you definitely did tell me this. You're
um,
absolutely right.
and it was just sort of a like, well, we're fiddling around with these, trying to get them working in 3 different builds right now. Let's just order the parts and then get the thing they recommend. And so like over the last couple of years, we've had um, 3 Max, the orange type hop up. They're sort of standard AEG hop
Yeah, the
up.
Max Pro, I think.
Yeah. We've had 1 without the latch and 2 with that we've gotten working in various things. Um, the They wandered really nicely into my AEG build and didn't really have a whole lot of issues there. Then I switched over to a Kythera, and it worked fine with that. And then I switched over to the
Fusion engine.
thank you, brains. I switched over to the Fusion engine, and it worked terribly with that. And I was like, "What the hell? Why isn't this working?" And went and checked, and they make a specific one for the Fusion engine. The hell with you, Pat. So I said, "All right, credit card already hates me for what I've done. Let's just continue the problem."
Yeah, just swipe. Yeah.
I am no longer thinking about this sensibly. The hell with it.
Yeah.
And that the one that they make for the Fusion engine fixed the problem instantly. Great. Have zero complaints. So we've changed our hop up. We haven't really changed our barrels. Prometheus was for a long while considered to be one of the best manufacturers, I think, for airsoft.
Certainly the best that was available to us here in Eastern Canada, let's call it.
Absolutely. And that was one of the big things I was going to say was that we've had a choice for quite a while between sort of spending $80 on a Prometheus barrel of the appropriate length to my door, or spending $200 to order one from the States. And like, there is a difference between a $40 6.3 millimeter type bore. Like, I've used the aluminum Mad Bull ones, I've used steel Mad Bull ones, I've used Prometheus ones. The Prometheus ones are better. You do get a better quality product for your twice as much money. That's not always going to be the case, I'm sure, but in that case, I do agree. Is the difference enough that I'm willing to pay the money? Yes. Has that always been true? No. There have been versions of Pat that had less money that were like, you know what, I will just buy the aluminum Mad Bull and it will do everything I want it to do today at a price I can afford. So possibly the 6.01 type bores that we've been looking at end up being in that sort of category as well. I also have been kind of conservative about them, the 6.01 specifically, because we very early in me getting into teching and in one of Phil's earliest forays into it as well, we put a 6.01 into a bolt action, and it jammed up horribly under someone else's use, and it was just a huge pain in the hole. Now
we kind of swore him off after that.
Yeah, it was sort of like now I actually do think very solidly that the problem in that case was the user, and maybe we did something wrong, but probably just the guy was a bit of
Porque no los dos.
Oh well, yeah,
but yeah,
fair.
I would agree.
He was the sort of person who, when he jammed 9 BBs into the barrel of the bolt action, then kicked the bolt out the back end of the gun. So yeah, like, not the kind of person you want to treat as a reliable source.
But speaking of reliable sources, though, we have it from reliable sources on the Discord. At least one reliable source, and then, let's say Chaz. I'm just kidding, buddy. No, so we've had multiple people on the Discord tell us that they've ran 6.01 millimeter barrels for a long time and had no issues. And that really, it's been, 10 plus years since we had that issue with that particular barrel, probably even longer than that, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And so I think the time is right for us to sort of explore. But like you said, do I expect it to be twice as good for a barrel that is twice as expensive? Like, probably not. But it's definitely, an experience that we want to go down. Right.
Yeah. And I'm delighted to try it. It's just a matter of where I want to put it in the priority of things to spend my airsoft budget on. And, at this point, it's getting further up that because I've probably bought many of the bad things that I want to do.
Okay, so listen, it's been like half an hour or something. We still haven't really talked about HPA. Like, we briefly touched on it, but I think that is probably like the biggest thing in terms of our long range. I mean, your rifle, my rifle that's going to have a Kythera in it. Like, there is also an appeal for using HPA for this sort of like higher end accurized builds, right? You can use HPA for anything. Don't get me wrong. That's not what I'm trying to say, but that's the direction that you took your rifle. And I would say, from my perspective, that it is much more accurate as an HPA rifle than it was previously, is my sense of it.
So, the I think the way I tend to look at it at this point, having sort of played around with both, uh, is that it is very doable to build a really accurized AEG that fires in semi quite consistently. Um, it is also a bit hard on the AEG to do it.
Yeah.
So the piece that I felt became problematic, and this isn't why I switched to HBA. I switched to HBA literally because Steph got a Kythera. It was fun, and I wanted to play with it. So like my starting point was not mechanical advantage. It was this is cool.
Yeah.
um, so going from there, um, my experience with the Kythera was that it definitely provided me with really consistent shot to shot accuracy, um, which was really excellent. I was super, super impressed with that. And it did so out of the box without what I felt was a ton of work. Like, yes, I had to mess around with the gearbox shell that I was installing it into to get it to fit correctly. Um, but the level of irritation that went into getting it set up, so that it was firing quite nicely relative to the level of irritation that went into creating the sort of comparable performance in my AEG, was substantial.
Hmm.
And there were also several less failure points. The Kythera has the drawback that you have to take it apart every 20, 30,000 shots and lube it. More often is better probably, but like, you have to
Good thing
take
you
it.
just told me that, because I didn't know, and that means I'm gonna have to loop it between games apparently.
Well, there we'll figure that out. So that had definite benefits. Getting the fusion engine dialed in as nicely as the Kythera came out of the box took a little bit of work too, and I still want to play around with some shims in it some more. But that's not a criticism of the fusion engine. It's more of I can do more with this. Cool. Um, there's also an argument that was getting talked about on the Discord that maybe I'm over voluming my barrel anyway and need to think about that. So that's in the back of my head to do.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, the Kythera turned out to be like primo. It's very, very fun to shoot, and it worked really, really well. One of the biggest things, to be honest, for me is that I felt more comfortable shooting it a lot. Um, in the sense that like I, there's no motor to overheat.
Yeah.
A few things like that, which is, probably just um, paranoia on my part, I think, to be honest with you. But
I don't think so, because I feel the same way, man. Like I've played games where my AG motor, yeah, I get Phil shoots a lot, ha ha ha. Okay, fine. But like I've played games where like my motor does get hot, and I'm like, man, like maybe I should shoot a little bit less. But then I think about it, and I'm like, my motor is getting hot, and I've only put like 200 rounds through it. Right now, I'm shooting really fast, and it's a lot to start stop because it's semi only. Because we talk about I don't really shoot full auto, so the motor's getting hot, and like it's a thing, right? You're thinking about that,
yep,
or you should be thinking about that. If you're at a point where your gun is like, you've put some upgrades and you're pushing your performance and stuff, you probably are thinking about that kind of stuff. It's a real thing. Like I don't think there's anything um out of turn of thinking about, oh, like am I shooting too much, or is something going to give. And to be honest with you, that is something I'm looking forward to about the Kythera is, well, it's going to be semi-auto only, obviously, because of the nature of that particular engine. But I'm not going to have to worry
yep,
about, oh, like, am I overstressing my motor? Is my gearbox going to explode because the spring is just going, or the spring is dying, and my velocity is going down consistently, or my muzzle energy, I should say, excuse me, is going down consistently, like we've had happen, in the past.
yep,
Am I
and
going to pass chrono today? If I want to, right?
yeah,
Like fundamentally,
and
right?
one of the nice things about HPA in a general sort of sense that's definitely at this point for me come back to being worth it. I still own AEGs. I still love playing with AEGs. Don't get me wrong. But like my air quotes serious airsoft gun is a HPA gun.
Hmm.
Um, you know, and that's going to stay the case for the foreseeable future for a couple of reasons. But one of the big ones is just that if I really want to run it as a DMR, I can literally just turn a screw.
Yeah, yeah,
And change a single setting on the FCU, which takes like 2 minutes. Great. You know, will I have to re-zero it? Yes. So am I going to do that without like tuning it up first? No. But it means that if I want to show up and use that gun for a Saturday in the summer, then all I have to do is go and dial it in at the higher FPS or the higher muzzle energy
Yeah.
before I go play, and then I'm good to go. And that's extremely cool. It's not, you know, flawless, you know, as you know, was pointed out in the Discord the last time we did one of these. The bolt action, you know, HPA or otherwise, will produce, yes, a more consistent result just because of the way it works. But I do want to get as much consistency out of this as I can, and the fact that it gives me flexibility is really cool. You know, if I wanted to go to a CQB game, I could just turn it way down and go.
Yeah.
You know, I'm more likely at this point to use the SMG, but like that wasn't a thing that I owned when I made that decision.
Yeah.
You know, and like one of the other big practical things is that running a really accurized AEG on semi does put strain on all the components you're running. You know, there's no really two ways around that. It's just, yeah, this is an intensive bit of stuff you're asking your tiny air compressor to get through.
Yeah, I
Um,
agree.
and the Kythera is just going to do it fine. It's not a solution to every single problem. But my goal was, okay, so I want to run a semi-auto accurized rifle, pushing out to that 200-foot range bracket comfortably. And I did my
I think
reading, and
too.
it can. Okay.
Yeah. There's this other thing with HPA, which is a thing that you and I had talked about even before we were really considering HPA, was this idea that you get to set the energy, right? Whereas with an AEG, like I remember many times where we were like, oh, I put an M120 in that. Oh, it's shooting over 1.6 joules. Okay, well, I need to wear it in, quote unquote, to get it to pass chrono, which is foolish, or you need to just swap to an M110, which is what we ended up doing anyway, so that you get into that 1.4 joule range instead,
Yep. And
right?
especially
But
because
if
you put in the max hop up and you're like, oh yeah, like this will fix my feeding issues. And it's like, it will. Turns out it will also bump your FPS by between 10 and 25.
yeah, and so with the HPA, like you can get to that middle ground where you're shooting, if your limit at your field is 1.60 like it is at ours and you want to shoot 1.59 consistently, you can dial your air so that you do exactly that. Now, I don't necessarily recommend, I don't think that your velocity limit is like a speed limit, like you should be trying to hit it every time. But if you wanted to, you can. And
Yep.
that's something that an AEG or a Springer or whatever just can't do that, right? It cannot give you that level of micro adjustments. And again, like you're talking about over voluming or whatever else, like there's a lot more accommodation that exists in that sphere because you're controlling specifically everything about it very precisely, as opposed to just,
Yeah.
from
And
my perspective anyway, slap it in there and hope for the best, kind of based on what manufacturers say an M110 should be shooting, etc.
you know, you don't have to deal with the fact that different manufacturers use the same numbers for different values.
Yeah.
But you know, I'd be lying if I said there weren't, you know, weren't drawbacks there in terms of especially really learning how to tinker with either the Kythera, which is a mechanical system, or the Fusion Engine, which is a digital one. But like, if you're trying to build for, you know, long range effectiveness, I do think they're really quite good tools. You know, I'm not quite willing to say like, you know, oh, you know, ditch your AG. Like, I'm certainly not there. Uh, but if you are sitting there going, okay, well, I really want to make a highly accurized, like moderate to long range airsoft build, and you're also still wanting to keep sort of the functionality of like a semi-automatic rifle, I think they're a really good thing to look at. I think that you are better off at least thinking about HPA at this point. Um, you know, the barrier to entry is definitely higher than taking your AEG and upgrading it. Uh,
Yeah, absolutely.
but there are some upsides. Uh,
Yeah.
you know, and I'm all about getting feedback on that. I'd love to hear other people's opinions on it. I um, I do think in a lot of ways, some of the stuff that we have sort of traditionally run is, I won't say like a bad idea, but it's definitely choosing to do maintenance intensive things for the sake of um, effect while playing.
Yeah.
So like, um, I didn't have the same issues because I just wasn't shooting as much as Phil. But I definitely would have, like, if we just swapped guns for a season, it would have been my rifle that was
Having all the
having
issues.
the
Yeah,
mechanical issues.
totally.
Like, it's just a, like, one of the specifically recurring things, and it's a cheap solution. Like, it's really easy to fix, but Phil burns through motor brushes pretty quickly, or has done. And
Hmm.
it's just the trigger response that he wants in an AEG setup requires us to build it a certain way, and that way is hard on the motor.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to probably a different set of problems. I won't say none, but the variety will be nice at minimum. And
Yeah.
um, you know, the Kythera, I've used one in a short gun, belonged to Steph. I've used one in a long gun, belonged to me. They perform really well. Um, they definitely require fiddling around with to get set up, but I'm really impressed, and the price point is really good. As far as an engine goes, um, the sort of the air tank and the regulator are definitely a barrier to entry thing. Having one of them makes buying more HPA guns a lot cheaper, which is really bad for me. But
I think ultimately, whether you decide to go AEG or HPA, especially when you're trying to build an accurized long range rifle, that leads to, well, attacking aside, it also leads to gameplay changes as well, right?
yeah,
And
and
um,
not the ones people necessarily think.
I sort of said this at the start, but when you increase your range, there's something that actually is, I think, a lot of airsofters chase, really, is this idea of, I want my gun to shoot further, right? Or we talked about this as well on the episode many years ago, which is crazy to think. But anyways, um,
Mm,
we talked about this before, which is that when you say you want more range, what you're really talking about is you want more achievable accuracy. Like, you want to be able to hit people when you aim at them at a longer distance, right? And the idea, I think the fundamental concept is probably fine, which is that if you have more range than the other person, you can stay further back outside of their range and hit them before they can hit you.
yeah, I mean,
And
I've
that
had
makes sense, right?
yeah, well, I mean, I've had a lot of situations, even just looking at the last season, um, or the last two seasons where I've been running the HPA setup, which, like I said, I've been really really happy with,
Mhm.
in terms of performance, where I'm playing, and like, even not sort of necessarily situations where, like, I'm pushing the extreme range of my gun and they're pushing the extreme range of theirs, but just where, like, we're 80, 90 feet apart, 120 feet apart, and uh, I have a accurized age or an accurized, I almost said AG, yeah, an accurized rifle, uh, and a magnified optic, and so I can see exactly where my BBs are going and put them exactly where I want them to be, and the other person doesn't, and so they are shooting, within 6 or 8 inches of me or a foot of me, and they need 5 rounds, and I hit them in the head
Yeah.
or in the chest,
The
and that's that, and that feels real good.
Yeah, but I would say on the flip side, when once you've done that a couple of times, the other player is also chasing that, right? So you have this, I hate to use this term, but this arms race, right? This escalation, right? So initially, the first time you show up and you're shooting folks, 180 feet away or whatever, they're going like, "Oh my god, he's got so much range," and they're going home and they're doing the research, maybe listening to this podcast and figuring out how to upgrade their airsoft gun to do the same thing. And the next time you go, you're shooting at 180 feet and they're shooting at 180 feet, and then really your advantage that you've got is really fleeting, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's
And
it's not a matter of as easy as it perhaps is to think, oh man, like this is kind of a pay to win thing for airsoft, it's not. Um, I've certainly, and we've talked about this before in the sense of, we've had an episode on whether or not airsoft is pay to win. So I've paid for mechanical advantage, definitely, right?
Yeah.
If you show up and are using a stock or even a lightly upgraded AEG and you're trying to engage me um, inside of my comfortable range, you're not at your comfortable range, and oops. So the question becomes, I think, how do we address that? So if you're playing against me, you shouldn't be engaging me at my comfortable range and your uncomfortable range. Now,
Yeah, exactly right.
the problem, and it's funny, I was thinking about this as we did sort of the preamble to this before we started up. Um, I would pay real cash money to see a lot of airsofters, especially YouTubers, um, who are talking about how they have this infinite range airsoft rifle, where they're like, oh, my airsoft replica shoots 100 meters, and it's like improbable. Carry on. I would love to see someone just like follow them around with a laser rangefinder and just pop up a little, this is how much they were off by in the corner of that video.
Yeah, really, hey.
Because to be clear, like I go play airsoft and I'm like, oh, it's 150 feet, and it's like 85. Or I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, that's 150 feet and it's 280. I'm like,
And that's such a good point
I'm bad at
because,
this.
well, the issue I think is that it's not just you. The vast majority of airsofters and people, I would say in general, are not good at estimating ranges, right? If you are in a trade of some sort, whether it's military, civilian, doesn't matter, where you've gotten accustomed to visually ranging out stuff, you might be pretty good at it. But I would say that's not the majority of people.
If
And
it's a
so
skill you
the
have, great.
impact,
But
well, yeah, but I would, based on my empirical evidence, the evidence of my eyes at the airsoft field and airsoft on YouTube and everywhere else, the vast majority, and I say this all the time, the vast majority of airsofters are garbage at ranging distances visually, and that includes me, right?
well, I mean, like,
And so the problem with that though is that you have guys who are chasing this idea of having longer range and doing all this kind of stuff, and including the drawbacks, which we talked about, like the added stress of the gearbox, obviously the more expensive parts,
the
the minimum engagement
distance.
distances, all that stuff, right? And all of this contributes to airsoft players who become like super passive, right? So you got guys who sit in their spawn or very near their spawn who are just shooting at the enemy that is 250 feet away or whatever, thinking that they're being some sort of like super important DMR for their team, blah blah blah, all this kind of stuff, or DM, not DMR, they're the DM, but whatever. Like they're doing this sort of like support function by sitting at the back of the field and not actually supporting in the meaningful way, right? And we've actually seen that sort of play out on our fields multiple times, even with you, Pat. Not because you were sitting behind, but because at the time, I remember this distinctly. We were not communicating.
Yep.
We were not talking, and so you had a rifle that was shooting longer distances. You were playing in a support role, but because we could not talk, you could not support us, and that was very frustrating for me. And that was very frustrating for you.
And
right?
I mean, that's sort of the punchline, right? So, um, the two things that I take away from that experience are, first up, you need to know what your gear can do, right?
Mm-hmm.
You need to know what is your comfortable. Yeah, if I drop the reticle that I'm using, whatever I'm using, over the torso of another player and pull the trigger twice, I'm gonna hit them. Right? You need to know what distance you can do that at reliably.
Yeah.
That's the distance you should be trying to play in. And like, I don't mean you need to know how many feet it is. I mean, you need to be able to eyeball it. You also need to be sensible and go, okay, that guy over there has a bolt action rifle. I'm going to treat that as though that distance for him is substantially further. And I'm going to take advantage of cover and not let him do that to me. Because if you just sort of like stand half out of cover and try to, 1v1 me, If I have that good distance and it's 20, 30, 50 feet longer than yours, you're making a mistake.
Yeah.
And again, like, it feels great for me, but I've been on the other end of that situation, right? I've played the opposite end of that. um, and it's foolish to play it any way other than a smart one. So how do you play it better, right? As either player. So if you're running the DMR, you still need to know what that distance is. If you've got a really accurized, moderate to long range setup, you're still looking at a situation where you probably don't actually want to just sit. If you can shoot 180 feet, you probably don't want to sit 180 feet away.
No,
Um,
definitely.
you know, like, there have been games where I was running that, Acura setup, especially like, so the season that I built the Kythera, we played some games in the village where I didn't enter the village. And some of those games we had wicked comms, and it was basically just sort of, we were using the fire lane that I was set up in to shape the engagement such that they either walked out into my fire lane or they were stuck up against the entirety of the rest of my team, and that worked really well.
Yeah.
We played other games where that wasn't what we were doing and we weren't really communicating, and where, in point of fact, like, there were 2 guys left on my team out of 6 or 7 because the beginning of the game went pear-shaped, which happens. And I'm still running a rifle where I can get further up and be an assaulter, and I wasn't, and I was useless.
Yeah.
Right? It's just,
And you need to understand, and we've talked about this many times, like, you need to understand your capabilities, you need to understand your team's capabilities too, because there's this notion, I think, and again, like, if you think about what happens on like YouTube, etc., you see all these like YouTubers are like, oh, well, he's got a sniper, so he's like the main character or whatever, right? And the problem though is that when you are in that role, like, you're not the main character, right? You're supporting a main action, right, of more people than you. And you need to understand what they're going to do and what they're capable of doing in order to support them. So what you said at the start, like, if your range has 180 feet, you shouldn't be 180 feet back, not just because your range is that's your maximum range, but also because your friendlies are likely going to push up past you and they're going to be engaging targets that are 120 feet from them when they're 80 feet in front of you. Well, I'm not strong in math, but that's 200 feet now. So did you move? Did you go with them? Did you support them? Did you understand, like, to your what you were just saying, like, we have an engagement that we shape understanding our capabilities. Now, I would say that at the random skirmish is probably not going to happen unless you have an organized bunch of people, which is fair enough. But especially if you're thinking about objective games or you're trying to be like a designated marksman in that sort of role at a larger game, like, you need to understand how your team is going to behave in order to be able to support them. And I can guarantee you that sitting back at your spawn or sitting 5 pieces of cover behind where the action is happening and shooting ineffectively forward, like we see basically all the time. Not from you, but I mean just in general.
I've had my days. Like,
Yeah, you've had your fair
let's be
share, but
real,
that's beside the point. I'm not throwing you under any bus. But the reality is, like, if that's how you're going to act as a DM, as a designated marksman, because you have this DMR rifle that you built and it's super accurized, it's super long ranges, and I'm doing all this in air quotes because none of this is necessarily, if this is your first time doing it, like, you might. Anyways, the point is, you're not where you need to be, both physically and in terms of your capabilities, that you're not going to support the team. And the last part, I think, is the most important, because we have had really, really good success over, 15, 16 years of playing as a team, right? As a result, maybe not those first couple of years, but definitely the later on. When I think about Mark and I think about Jason, I think about you, like, we've had really good success at utilizing those types of support roles when we had active participants, right? Who weren't just sitting back, but who were moving forward. You're pushing up a line, we're understanding how the battle is shaking out and understanding where do you need to apply your long range precision to support some of the movement that's happening further down the field.
the other,
right?
like, practical thing that's, I think, really worth mentioning there is, so if you're looking at the kind of um, DMR setups that are actually popular in airsoft generally, they are closer to what I'm running, right? They are
Mhm.
either at, like, I'm pushing the upper limit of rifle, or they are at I've stepped just above it into DMR, but I'm not at this is a bolt action and it has 100-foot MED.
Yeah.
So if you're rocking anything in that range of setup, the way I encourage you to think about it is yes, I can sit back and fire from 180 feet and hit people and be, frankly, extremely safe, right? Like, this is an option. But it's not a useful option, because the useful place for me is maybe 10 feet behind Phil, where the people who Phil is having trouble hitting because they're outside of that comfortable zone, that green zone that we were talking about for Phil's gun, are well within mine, right?
Yeah.
So they're in the Phil needs to take 5 shots to take this person out, I need to take 2 area. For me, that's where I want to keep the engagement. That is where I want to keep sort of my distance from whoever I'm playing against, right? If I have to move
Not to
inside of it,
mention,
fair enough, but that's where I want it to be.
well, and not to mention that you could utilize your greater range to get in a more advantage piece of cover that gives you a better angle on who you're trying to shoot compared to where I need to be in order to be as effective, right? So as I'm pushing up to your point 10 feet, or, whether it's 20 feet or even 30 feet, doesn't really make a difference, right? Like, I'm pushing up straight on. You can go to my left or you can go to my right as the battlefield sort of shakes out, and utilize some of those areas to put in, a flanking fire,
Yeah, and
right?
and be in one of
That
those
you could
situations.
get around their cover so that I can keep moving.
Well,
Right?
and be in one of these situations where, like, if I had the same range Phil does, although frankly at this point we're pretty close. Certainly after we put the Kytherian, we're going to be fairly 1-to-1 again. Although I have the magnified optic, which genuinely helps, right? There is that sort of like, well, I can be the longer side of the triangle pretty comfortably, carry on,
Yeah.
right? So the piece that I really, I guess, want to stress here is that um, it's still a game of fire and move. The more static I
Absolutely.
am, generally, the worse it is for me. Partly because if you're staying in one place, they're eventually going to figure out where you are, and like, "Oh, I've got a really great, 1-to-1 cool. There are 5 guys, and they're just pulling. They're on to auto, and they're holding it down, and I'm going to get hit. Like, it's just that's how that works.
Yeah.
But also, if you're not supporting the people on your team, and it doesn't matter if it's me and Phil. Yeah, okay, we work pretty well together. We have had a little bit of practice,
Yeah.
but it's not the critical piece there, right? So if I'm working with 2 brand new players, whether they're having an easy time moving up is irrelevant. I should be smoothing that out for them, because that's the
Yeah.
point of the way
Quite
my
right.
kit is set up, right? So, like, if we look at the village, there are a couple of places that become choke points that are a lot safer to erase from the field at my range band than at a standard AEG
Yeah.
assaulter
Absolutely.
point blank kind of range band. That doesn't mean you can't do it, but like, I can very easily go, I think that no one gets to stay on the 2 stories upper floors and shoot out of them today. Like, I can
Yeah.
just decide that. And that removes a thing that Phil has to worry about, right? It doesn't make it less of a problem. It removes it from the table.
Yeah. Exactly right.
So,
And that's really, that's how you really need to think about, if you're going down that sort of longer range route. You really need to start thinking about how you're going to utilize that range to support your team. And it's a lot less about how are you going to rack up the kills that day or whatever. Like, if you're playing team deathmatch, whatever, like, fine, fill your boots. But if you're playing an
personal skills
objective
games are
based
great.
game,
Don't get me wrong, right?
yeah, yeah. But if you're going to take this to some sort of objective team-based game where there's things that you need to achieve on the field, you need to think about how are you going to use this to support your team, and your ability to just go out willy-nilly and sort of push the objective or do whatever, comes secondary in a lot of cases. If you've built a kit that is supposed to be a support kit, well, support, right? It's like one of the guys who I like watching, who does like hockey commentary or whatever. It's like, if you're a goaltender, tend the goal. Well, if you're a support airsofter, support your team. Like, that's what you're supposed to do,
and
right?
and one of the really, like, this is going to sound really maybe daft, but one of the funny things for me is, so, like, I actually do also a lot of engaging targets outside the effective range of my gun. Because, so I will say for argument's sake that I've got a comfortable like 150, because I do, no problem. I
Hmm.
know for sure we've actually like taped that out and marked it off and done
Yeah,
dialed it in. 150, no problem. Um, so I do a lot of shooting at 200. But it's one of those things where, you know, if I'm 200 feet away from a guy who's in a window on the upper floor of that 2-story structure, can I hit them one or two trigger pulls? Nah, especially not if there's any kind of wind. Can I put their head down? Absolutely.
definitely.
If their head is
Yeah,
down, can my teammates do something about them? Right?
yeah. That's that support
You
role,
know,
right?
and I mean, this is also one of those things where like, um, I think the most frustrating recurring thing for me this season and the last season were days where like 4 of us showed up, but only 2 or 3 radios came, like in terms of our teammates, and like not, you know, to shit anyone, like stuff happens, whatever. But if I'm 200 feet away from the target and Phil's 50 feet away from the target, being able to go, hey, his head is down, do your thing, is really useful, because Phil knows
Yeah,
that
yeah,
shots are
totally.
going in that guy's general direction. He can hear them hitting the plywood or whatever, but he doesn't know that's someone on his team intentionally putting that head down. And if he does, that changes what he has in terms
Yeah,
of an option set.
information, right, makes a huge difference.
You know,
Um, so I'm gonna wrap it up, I think
yeah,
now.
for sure.
So for those of you who are in the chat, you can stick around. We're going to do a post show if you're interested in just chilling, ask a couple questions, have some conversation, maybe a couple of laughs about our favorite sport, Plasto Blasto. You heard it here first. That's what it's called now. It's not airsoft, it's Plasto
What
Blasto.
have you done?
Yeah. So we'll just do a quick wrap up and then we'll go to the post show. So obviously, like, you're gonna chase that longer range at some point. You know, if you're just starting out, or maybe you're in a position where you've already got like a pretty upgraded rifle and maybe you want to push it a little bit further.
I think everyone hits the
Just
point where they want to play around with it. I really do.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, we did, and we did, however many years ago, and now we're where we are now. But I think ultimately the biggest thing is just really consider which route you want to go with, in terms of like upgrades internally, whether you want to go HP, AEG, and the sort of the pitfalls that come with either. But especially really consider, like, okay, so if you're putting all this power, all this range in your airsoft rifle, how is that going to impact your play style? And our recommendation, of course, is don't let it impact your play style unless you're really willing to take it the full direction and go, full support, keep pushing, supporting your team and stuff. And that is, in our opinion, or at least in my opinion, I think Pat also shares it, that's where success is to be found, right? Again, airsoft, like we've said many times, is a team sport, right? And you need to be supporting your team. You need to be working with your team in order to achieve success. Like, yeah, if you're playing a random skirmish or whatever and it's 3-on-3 and you win lone wolf, congratulations. That's great. That's super fun, right?
Definitely.
But when you're talking about objective games and like milsim games and stuff, it's a team endeavor. And if you're playing a role that is much more of a supportive role, then you really want to just keep that in mind, in front of mind, as you go through it.
Anytime you're trying to do anything more complicated than win a team deathmatch, teamwork is super duper helpful. And honestly, even if you're trying to win a team deathmatch, it's still like, a fire team is way better than one dude, unless it's just the sort of like, free for all,
Mhm.
have fun. I will.
So, guys, that's it for us today. Just one final reminder: you can find a link to our Storm Riders official patch, Discord patch, as voted on by the Airsoft community, or the Discord Airsoft community. It's the link is on our Discord. It's going to be in the video as well. If you want to support the channel, we have merch on the store. Both excellent ways to support the channel directly. As a bit of an aside, we're not going to be partnering or trying to sell you any particular type of products or anything like that. That's not something that's of interest to us. And we respect your time enough to not want to pitch you stuff that we don't really care about, that you don't care about. You've seen it on a lot of different other social media. But, if you want a code for a set of Raycons or NordVPNs or whatever, you can find it somewhere else, but you're not going to find it
Yeah,
here.
we will not be
So if you
selling you
do want to
NordVPN.
support the channel, yeah, yeah. So if you really do want to support the channel, stuff like this, stuff like our merch store is a great way to do that.
And like, we're not.
Some other things that we're thinking about in the future, but we'll let you in on that later on as it comes comes up. But that being said, that is all that we have. If you want to keep the conversation going, please go ahead and join the Discord. Like I said, the link is in the description below. Thanks so much for listening, and we will talk to you next week.
And yeah, no, big thanks also to the people who tuned into us doing this live. It is still, I think, a little bit of a surreal experience for me, but definitely a really cool one.
Yeah. Cheers, everyone.
Have a good week.